What if the earliest warning sign of dementia wasn't forgetfulness, but a strange question, a peculiar phrase that sounds almost surreal, yet quietly reveals that something deeper inside the brain is starting to unravel? Most people brush these moments off. They think it's a joke or just a quirk of aging. But in hindsight, families often realize that's when it began. Because dementia doesn't always start with memory loss. Sometimes it begins with a breakdown in logic, language, and self-awareness. And the first red flag is a question that doesn't quite make sense. Before we dive deeper, if you haven't already, pause for a moment and subscribe now. Turn on the notification bell so you stay connected with vital brain health insights, the kind that could help you or someone you love spot these early clues before it's too late. This video reveals 9 unusual questions that people often start asking just before memory loss begins. Subtle signs that something's wrong long before dementia is suspected. Number 1. Where am I supposed to be right now? Wallace, 73, had never missed an appointment. At first, his wife thought he was joking when he asked this suddenly, while watching TV. But then he said it again at the grocery store, and again while resting in bed. It was as if something inside him no longer knew how to place itself in time. For 3 long years, those strange questions kept slipping out, until Wallace was finally diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. A major review found that temporal disorientation, losing track of time or place, is often one of the first cognitive changes in Alzheimer's. The hippocampus, which handles time and spatial memory, begins to falter. This question isn't about being physically lost. It's about a brain slowly losing its anchor in time. When this question appears in everyday settings without visible confusion, it's a subtle but serious warning that orientation and cognitive mapping are starting to fail. Number 2. Did I already ask you that? Betsy, 69, was always thoughtful and polite. But 2.5 years before she was diagnosed with early dementia, she began repeating herself, then catching it. "Did I already ask you that?" she'd say with a nervous laugh. It happened at breakfast, while folding laundry, even mid-phone call. Sometimes she looked embarrassed, other times quietly frustrated. A clinical study linked this kind of meta-questioning, where someone realizes they might be repeating, to an early stage of memory monitoring failure. They're still aware enough to sense something's off, but not enough to control it. It's a fragile in-between state, when memory is slipping, yet self-awareness hasn't fully gone. That awareness creates an emotional tension, a blend of fear, frustration, and self-doubt that marks the first cracks in cognitive stability. Number 3. Why does my head feel empty? 3 years before his diagnosis, Leon, 71, said this over lunch: "I don't know what I'm supposed to be thinking about." His wife assumed he was just tired, but the phrase kept returning. He'd stop mid-sentence, frown, and add softly, "My head feels empty again." He wasn't angry, just quietly puzzled. Later, he was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. Research shows that early dementia can disrupt working memory, the brain's ability to hold and manage thoughts in real time. When that system breaks down, it can feel like mental blankness. Not confusion, but absence. As if the mind is trying to think, but nothing loads. This sensation of inner emptiness often appears long before typical memory loss, and is easy to mistake for fatigue or distraction. If you're finding this helpful so far, type 1 in the comments and hit the like button. It helps us reach more people with vital brain health tips. Number 4. Am I acting weird today? Sandra pulled her daughter aside one afternoon and asked, "Am I acting strange today? You keep looking at me funny." Her daughter was surprised. She hadn't noticed anything unusual. But Sandra brought it up again 2 days later, and again at a family gathering. She wasn't paranoid or defensive. She seemed genuinely curious and a bit worried. 2 years later, at age 81, Sandra was diagnosed with early Alzheimer's. A scientific review found that some people experience an early form of self-monitoring decline, a faint awareness that something feels off even before anyone else notices. This question isn't delusional, it's the brain trying to check itself but struggling to get a clear signal. When this kind of self-questioning becomes frequent, it reflects one of the earliest and most delicate signs of cognitive breakdown, the slow fading of self-awareness. Number 5. Is it normal to forget what you're doing while you're doing it? Joseph, 74, began asking this after a few small lapses. Once, while washing the dishes, he just stopped, frozen, staring at a sponge in his hand. Later, he asked his wife that question with quiet concern. Is it normal to forget what you're doing while you're doing it? Those moments kept happening. He even paused halfway through tying his shoes, standing motionless for minutes, trying to remember what came next. 4 years after those early episodes, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Research suggests that brief task disconnection is a hallmark of early dementia. The brain loses its ability to track a sequence of actions, behaviors that once ran automatically. It's as if the thread of the task snaps mid-action. These micro-failures often begin subtly, but once the person notices them, it's a critical sign that cognitive systems are starting to unravel. If you're finding these clinical signs helpful, type 1 in the comments. If you'd like us to explore other health topics, type 0. Your feedback guides exactly what we share next. Number 6. Did I always live here? 2 years before her diagnosis, Sheila, 70, asked this question in her own kitchen. Her husband thought she meant their town or neighborhood, but she was referring to the actual house they'd lived in for 40 years. A week later, she asked again, then again while folding towels she'd owned for decades. Eventually, she began saying that the walls looked unfamiliar, that the house didn't feel like hers anymore. A large study found that damage to the posterior cingulate cortex, the brain region responsible for spatial and autobiographical memory, can cause people to question where they are, even in familiar surroundings. It's not about forgetting directions, it's the unsettling sense that home no longer feels like home. When even the most familiar spaces start to feel foreign, it signals the brain is entering a fragile, lucid stage of dementia. Number 7. Do you think people are watching me? About 18 months before his diagnosis with Lewy body dementia, Norman, 74, whispered to his daughter, "I think the neighbors are spying on us." At first, it sounded like a joke, but then he kept glancing out the windows. He unplugged the Wi-Fi. Later, he asked if the TV could hear them. Soon, he refused to open the curtains, convinced someone might be watching. A medical study found that early paranoia and suspicion can appear in some forms of dementia, especially Lewy body and certain Alzheimer's variants. The brain begins misreading patterns, interpreting harmless sounds or coincidences as threats. These suspicions aren't random. They're the product of a brain that's losing its ability to filter reality correctly. Number 8. Was I always like this? When Lester, 73, broke down crying at tragic news, his wife was stunned. He had never been emotional like that. That night, he looked at her and asked, "Was I always like this?" He wasn't talking about that one moment. He meant his entire personality. Then he went quiet, almost startled by his own question. 2.5 years later, he was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. Scientists confirmed that personal confusion often emerges when the brain's self-awareness networks begin to fail, especially in the prefrontal cortex, which helps us maintain a stable sense of identity. When those systems weaken, people may suddenly feel like strangers to themselves. They're not just losing memories, they're losing their emotional compass. These moments of self-questioning come from deep inside, as the person senses that something fundamental is changing, even if they can't describe it. Number 9. Are you sure that happened? Glinda, 76, began doubting her own memories. Her daughter would say, "Remember our trip to Seattle?" And Glinda would answer, "Are you sure that happened?" It wasn't denial. It was a quiet, sincere doubt. The photos were there, but the connection was gone. Once, she even stared at a birthday photo of herself and asked, "When was that taken?" 3 years later, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Studies show that early dementia often damages episodic memory, the type that ties emotion and personal experience to events. Facts and places might remain, but the emotional thread connecting them begins to fray. That missing link makes shared memories feel unreal, as if they happened to someone else. These aren't just strange questions, they're tiny fractures in the brain's foundation, appearing long before memory loss becomes obvious. One odd question might seem harmless, but when they start coming often and feel off somehow, listen. By the time someone forgets what's happening, the brain may have been warning them for years. If you found this video eye-opening, please take a moment to subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss practical, science-backed brain health insights that could help you or someone you love act early. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this video stood out the most? Do you have experiences or questions to share? Drop your thoughts below. Your comments inspire us to keep creating helpful, life-changing content for families everywhere. And don't forget to share this video with someone you care about, because early awareness could truly make all the difference.